Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Elise. I'll just share the screen now. Actually, I suppose today is a demonstration of the challenges and complexities of trying to do intercultural phenomenology. And I'm actually not going to have a great deal of time to try and justify the methodological framework within which I'm working. I'm just going to go ahead and try and do it and try and show a little bit one of the examples of grounded comparative phenomenology. So the title of the book, the talk is slightly different in the sense that I felt that in the end, it would be too abstract to simply talk about this concept of ecological phenomenology, to which I'll turn in a few minutes, that I was really trying to demonstrate it in the application to a particular context so that I can try and convey what it is that I'm trying to do here. So, very briefly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Buddhist text I'm going to be looking at. Then I'm going to peel away and look at the other side of the intercultural phenomenology, in this case, with some of the work of Merleau-Ponty. And having sort of gone through some of the well-known aspects, I'm not saying anything new, I'm just laying out more a picture of what I'm interested in what he's written. I will then step back into this Buddhist text, look at it rather more carefully, analyze its intricacies, and it's a very intricate text. And then out of that, I'll pull out what I hope will be a demonstration of this concept of ecological phenomenology that Maria Heim and I have been talking about for some years. So the work that I'm going to be looking at is one called the Visuddhimagga, or the Path of Purification in Pali, by this towering 5th century figure called Buddhaghosa, who was an Indian monk from the Theravada Buddhist tradition, who almost entirely single-handedly revivified the textual study of the Pali canonical materials in Sri Lanka. In the Visuddhimagga, amongst a huge number of books that he wrote, or he co-wrote, or he oversaw the writing of, the Visuddhimagga is the single most important sort of manual which continues to be used to this day in Buddhist meditative and monastic practices. In that, he talks about the 3 central teachings of the Buddha as he understands it, which is the interplay between morality, modes of conduct, the ethical attitude that's called sila, consciousness or mind, the phenomenological subjectivity, that is chitta, and the arising of that insight in an individual, the insight that the Buddha taught, called wisdom or panya. So it is within this text and its modal structure that I'm going to try and detect an example of what I'm calling ecological phenomenology. So the meditative manual is not just about contemplation. It's not just, as it were, about keeping one's eyes shut and thinking about abstract forms, although that's also there. It covers an extended set of practices of concentration, which are also very often inactive, which involve particular kinds of movements, day-to-day actions, even such things as cleaning the monastery. These practices of concentration are meant to cultivate the mind. I use the word within inverted commas because we should be careful, of course, not to think of it in Cartesian terms or post-Cartesian terms, but rather there's the awareness, the subjectivity in the practitioner. And through this cultivation of concentration, one is supposed to progress through ever finer phenomenological analysis of the subjectivity that one is going through in the course of all these practices, be they sitting and meditating or cleaning the monastery or walking a particular path or whatever. And we will see a fairly extreme and challenging form of concentration practice soon. So the idea is that this kind of continuous examination of the content of subjectivity in the course of a structured monastic life leads to insight into the way things are. And the way things are is in accordance with what the Buddha taught. And once you arrive at that insight of the way things are, the suffering that comes from not knowing the way things are will go. I don't want to say more about that because immediately one then enters into the density of Buddhist hermeneutics. I just want to say that that is the overarching purpose, to gain the insight that the Buddha taught. But the passage to that is this rigorous and multidimensional form of analysis of subjective states, and therefore can be called a disciplinary phenomenological practice. Looking at it in detail, I hope, will say something about a form of phenomenology here, which is interesting conceptually in a particular Western framework, but is also illuminating in its own right. So let's step back a little bit and think about the nature of the subject who is who's both the subject and the object of phenomenological analysis, the one that one might call the bodily being. As we know, in the history of the emergence of phenomenology in the 20th century, there is an attempt to break free of the dualisms of early modern Western thought, particularly articulated, of course, in Descartes, who takes the categories of mind and body, which in the West have existed, of course, since the time of the Greeks, but places it in this powerful but problematic dynamic in which the relationship between the mind and the body is not simply of two elements in an ontology of reality, but rather, on the one hand, that which seeks to know an ontology and that which is known in that ontology, thereby, of course, raising the specter of skepticism, of asking how it is that even the knowledge of the existence of the mind and body can be known, and if they are two such fundamentally different categories rather than variations within a larger ontology, how is it that they are even connected? So we have those familiar issues that arise in the late modern questioning of early modern dualism in the West. Out of it, of course, we know the paradox that emerges in trying to break through the bafflement of contemplating the body and the world through the mind is a paradox that the contemplating subject, the one who seeks to know, is one at the same time seeking to know a world that is not it, that is the object and therefore not the subject of that knowledge, and yet, of course, is itself an object in that very world. So the challenge becomes how to explain the human subject in its world. So this is the return to the location of the subject in the world that it is studying, that phenomenology sets out to solve, given the problem created by the Cartesian epistemological project. Again, as many of you will know, what Maurice Merleau-Ponty attempts to do is to find a way of categorizing the phenomenological subject, the bodily being, through the notion of an inter-involvement, to try and develop a concept by which the world, the object, including the physical body, that is the object of awareness, is not, even while being objective, not separate from the subject that is considering it, because that subject itself is located in the environment which it is examining. So in the notion of the lived body, Merleau-Ponty tries to overcome the chasm between mind and body that Cartesian dualism has generated. To just run through a couple of framing paragraphs on the way in which phenomenology seeks, especially in Merleau-Ponty, but more generally, to use the notion of the lived body to blur the divide that Cartesian dualism has opened up. Here's a passage well known from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Phenomenologists distinguish the pre-reflective body awareness that accompanies and shapes every spatial experience from a reflective consciousness of the body. To capture this difference, Husserl introduced a terminological distinction between Leib and Körper, that is, between the pre-reflectively lived body, the body as an embodied first-person perspective, and the subsequent thematic experience of the body as an object. So what happens here is to draw attention to the fact that the body for Descartes is this body as an object. So of course, the body comes into the attention of the mind of the subject reflectively. But what the phenomenologist wants to do is that before that program of objectification happens, one must realize that what is being objectified here, that is to say the body as an object, is nevertheless also that in which the subject is embodied. So in a sense, by opening up the awareness of the pre-reflective, the reflectivity on which Descartes focused becomes, in a way, grounded in something more complex. So in that context, we have in the Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty saying the psychophysical event, which is the body's contemplation of itself, as it were, can no longer be conceived after the model of Cartesian physiology and as the juxtaposition of a process in itself, the body, and a cogitatio, the mind. The union of soul and body is not an amalgamation between two mutually external terms, subject and object, brought about by arbitrary degree. It is enacted at every instant in the moment of existence. So this is what I was getting at, to say that what phenomenology needs to do through the notion of the lived body is to draw attention to the fact that the Cartesian act of looking at the process of the body is not an act in itself. It is not, in fact, the way things are. It is a particular way of thinking about how things already are, which is that even before one begins the Cartesian process of meditation on the body and the relationship between the subject and the object, one is already existing in this sort of union. It is not an amalgamation that is brought together that bridges the divide, because that is what Descartes' own view and argument shows cannot be done. How do we do it? We step back and say, well, actually, in the process of the investigation, it looks like one thing is trying to bridge a relationship with the other thing, but actually they are in the lived body one and the same. So true reflection presents me to myself not as an idle and inaccessible subjectivity, he goes on, but as identical with my presence in the world and to others, as I'm now realizing it. I'm all that I see. I'm an intersubjective field, not despite my body and historical situation, but on the contrary, by being this body and the situation, and through them all the rest. So he says you can't even get to, as it were, the Cartesian point without being a non-Cartesian subject. So you get to the Cartesian point by thematizing that which you're studying, and then ask yourself how it is that you, the subject, are in relationship. No, says Merleau-Ponty. Even to come to that point is already to pre-exist where there is no such divide. The contemplation itself is an intersubjective field. I, who am the subject, I'm part of that very field that I take myself to be accessing, to be reflecting upon. So in a sense, what he tries to do is to say, don't even go down to the place where Descartes finds himself caught in trying to overcome the divide. Rather, step back and be aware that even before you start thematizing, you are already in an intersubjective field in which the subject-object difference makes no sense. So just to give a couple of other passages which try and seek to explain this from Burlington's paper on the expression of the psychosomatic body, let's take the second passage. Merleau-Ponty's notion of the lived body and structure transformation provides a philosophical alternative to the objectivistic epistemology that focuses on the objective body, as seen from a God's eye perspective. The lived body is understood as a mind-body presence always directed towards the world. Therein, a field arises, an in-between that is constituted in terms of situations to be mastered and understood. So what strikes me about this way of looking at it is something that is brought out in the previous passage quoted about at the top of the slide. This in-between world, it's an ambiguous unity, both mind and body, intertwined, understood in terms of levels. Now, what's going on here? What's going on here is that, try as you might, the phenomenologist is faced with the language of Descartes to overcome. The categories of mind and body are now present in the way of the philosophical way of thought. So even while seeking, as Burlington does here, to explicate Merleau-Ponty's way of trying to go behind the Cartesian divide, the philosopher finds himself or herself caught in equivocation between a unity, which is pre-Cartesian, and its ambiguity brought about by the very act of a Cartesian meditation. It's ambiguous, this unity, because are you not able to think of the subject as the inaccessible mind that only accesses the world? Yes. There is an ambiguity here about the relationship between the mind and the body, because in a way, the Cartesian shock has already happened. The language has already been shattered by the dualism. So you can only put together what Descartes has sundered. So all the time, you are in this ambiguous language. You talk about a presence, but you talk about it as mind-body. So you are having to use the very language that you're seeking to overcome. And Merleau-Ponty, towards the end of his life, in The Visible and the Invisible, Unfinished, and the notes that he was writing at the time, was striving to get to the very boundaries of a way of looking that, while inheriting this Cartesian paradigm, was seeking nevertheless to find a different way of talking about it. So he says in this passage, when we turn in the direction of the seer, the subject mind, we do not discover a transcendental ego, but a being who is itself of the sensible, a being which knows it before knowing it. The sensate body possesses an art of interrogating the sensible according to its own wishes. One of my most favorite phrases, I think, in modern philosophy. It's an inspired exegesis of the body. My hand which touches the thing is itself subject to being touched. Through this crisscrossing within it of the touching and the tangible, its own movements incorporate themselves in the universe that they interrogate, are recorded on the same map as it. So what in his, again, I don't want to get bogged down in something that I'm not a specialist on, which is the relationship between the phenomenology of perception and the visible and the invisible. How much was there continuity? How much of it was a radical change? That's a special topic for Merleau-Ponty scholars. What I do at least want to say is that in The Visible and Invisible, Merleau-Ponty is trying to push away at simply overcoming the divide by holding this ambiguous unity of mind and body together. What he is rather trying to do is to say that the only way you can talk about the way we are is that the body is sensate, the mind is bodied. So there is always this moving and enfolding upon itself. It folds together, so that in the analysis, it might seem as if you are using the Cartesian divide of the mind and the body, the mind and the world, the subject and the object. But actually you find that there is no conceptualization possible of the world that presents to the subject, except in terms of the presence of the subject in it. And exactly the same way, the subject is nothing other than what in its sensate presence in the world, it finds itself. So this way is not to put together what Descartes has sundered, but rather to say there never was two things to be put together in the first place. That illusion comes from looking at the two sides of something that folds in on itself. And that, of course, is this concept of the flesh. As Flynn writes of Merleau-Ponty, the flesh is neither some sort of ethereal matter, nor is it a life force that runs through everything. Rather, it is a notion which is formed in order to express the intertwining of the sensate and the sensible, their intertwining and their reversibility. It is this notion of reversibility that most directly problematizes the concept of intentionality, since rather than having the model of act and object, the Cartesian model, one has the image of a fold, and of the body as a place of this fold by which the sensible reveals itself. Now you start seeing why we might think of the bodily being when we talk of Merleau-Ponty. So the bodily being is in being the subject, one is already bodily. The bodiliness is itself subjective. So this reversibility, the flesh that falls in on itself seeks, as it were, to offer an alternative paradigm, not of the overcoming of the difference as perhaps we might find in the phenomenology of perception, but rather a different way of saying it is impossible, in fact, to make that divide that seems so self-evident when Descartes is doing it. So then the question therefore comes, what is this? Why is there this doubleness? Let us now say, therefore, that we have in the later writings of Merleau-Ponty, at least an example, a very powerful, potent example within the Western tradition of seeking to move around what's, as I said, Descartes seemed to have made obvious. And that obviousness is this ambiguity which I would say that phenomenologists, perhaps before Merleau-Ponty, simply left as ambiguous between the corpore and the lee. Whereas what he was trying to say was, there isn't an ambiguity. But why do we feel that? Says Maria Heim and I have written in a paper that came out a few years ago, the phenomenological field allows a shifting of focus onto different interpretations of its content, varying according to intention, not intention as an intentionality, but in what you want to do, your purpose and attention. What we notice and why we do determines whether we note our bodiliness in its objective constituents or its subjective implications, but each leads back into the other. This is the conception of an ecological phenomenology. So the way we're trying to begin to answer this is by saying, why do we have a sense of an objective body and a subjective body? Well, it's because it depends on what we are turning our subjectivity to. So it's not that we are concerned so much to offer an ontological solution to why it seems like there is an objective body and a subjective body. Rather, we're asking, why is that compelling sense of ambiguity? Well, it's because our needs change. What we are doing with subjectivity changes. And that's something which is not particularly complicated when we think of very grounded examples. It is one thing to feel the sensation of burning in the hand as a burning, which is an experience, a phenomenological state. So you are burning. You are burning because in your bodily whole is a subjective state in which the body is alive. The living body burns. On the other hand, you might also look at that and say, oh, what a particular strange pattern. The burn is taking exactly the shape of the object that fell on my skin. There, what has happened is the shift to what burnt my hand. Oh, what burnt my hand was that, I don't know, hot, electrical equipment or something. Immediately, the intention of the consciousness is to turn to looking at the body in its aspectus corpora as the objective body. That's a very ordinary example, but that's precisely the point. In that ordinary example, we would argue, you see exactly how the appeal of the Cartesian idea lies. Because when there is a particular subjective attention for a particular purpose, it seems as if what is present is the subject, the knowing subject, the feeling subject, the one who is the location in whom the experience happens, for whom the experience happens. And yet there is also a reason and a purpose for why one might look at the object, the body, as something to be looked at as the object of attention. So, excuse me, the doubleness is not a mysterious ontological fact. It is not even an ontological fact that needs to be overcome by a different account, such as the one Merleau-Ponty seeks. Rather, what we are suggesting is it is simply the context in which the phenomenological attitude occurs. In the context of a purpose of, say, coping with a sense of pain, there is a sense of the body as lived body. In the context of trying to figure out what did the burn so that there could be appropriate treatment for it, the body presents as the objective body. These are contextualized by why we are undertaking a very basic phenomenological project, which is what we are doing. The phenomenological project of saying, how am I going to cope with the pain? The phenomenological project of saying, what is it that gave me that pain? Are actually simple versions of the elaborations all the way from a philosopher like Merleau-Ponty to the kind of rigorous meditative practices that Buddhaghosa we're going to see doing. So why do we call this an ecological phenomenology? At this point, what we are saying is it's ecological in the sense it is dependent on the context in which the subjectivity occurs. So it is always clued to a context. In this, we are just using ecology as a metaphor. So the same thing might be, for example, a tree in the forest is a single, or my favorite example usually is, are we going to look at, say, truffles now, or mushrooms? In one way, you could say that there is a single organism, perhaps 10 square miles in size, because the maculae intersect with each other so that we can call it a single organism which occupies the side of a hill. But if you're going to go and pluck individual mushrooms for a dish, then you say, oh, well, I brought a dozen mushrooms with me. Are we in the mysterious realm of the ontological problem of the one and the many? No. Our purpose, perhaps, as a biologist might be to think of a single organism. Our purpose as a chef might be to think of a dozen. It's the context. So an ecology is one in which once you situate an organism according to how you are examining it, you get different kinds of answers. So our idea is phenomenology is ecological in that way. There is no mysterious divide between the body as object and the body as subject, or the lived body and the objective body. Rather, depending on the purposes to which we put our attention, we read them in different ways, which explains why we might have the appeal of Descartes. When Descartes is setting forth on a particular kind of project, you can see why it becomes evident for him to then feel a distance between the subject or the mind and the object that it is looking at. Given that project that he is undertaking, it is no surprise that he is going to find that distance. That is simply a result of how our phenomenology is coded by the context in which it occurs. This is why we feel that we should not be thinking so much of the issue here of bodily phenomenology as an ontological one, requiring, for example, the postulation of flesh as a category. We think what ecological phenomenology suggests is that it is all about the method. It is all about undertaking the quest according to what you want as it. So we say as in the intention, that is to say in the purpose behind phenomenological focus that determines what and how we classify what we encounter, there is a continuous process, depends on shifts of attention. Any ontological commitment will simply be what is registered as an explanation during a suspension of the shift in focus. So we should look at the different conceptualizations of our being as a continuous method for clarification of our being. What do I mean here? What I'm saying is, in a very simplistic way, an ontology is simply an arbitrary stopping point in phenomenological explanation. So from Merleau-Ponty's point of view, Descartes simply stopped at this point of maximal perception of a distance between the subject and the object and created a dualist ontology. Whereas for Merleau-Ponty, he kept going to another place where he got this idea of flesh as something that folds in, that therefore doesn't stop in a Cartesian ontology. But why would we think that that is any less arbitrary in the process of investigation? And you have other people coming along and then challenging the notion of flesh, say, or rereading it, or trying to go radically beyond it and deconstruct the very notion of flesh. So the process carries on. So taking the long view, our critical suggestion here is that an ontology is simply the arbitrary suspension at some point of your phenomenological exploration. If all the time you're key to saying, well, I've stopped here because I'm comfortable, it's provisional. So it is not that we want ecological phenomenology to be able to give a once and for all answer of what is the nature of consciousness, what is the nature of being, what is the world and the self in it. Really, there is an important point behind saying it depends. It depends on the context in which you undertake that study. So in the concrete case I'm considering here, we're having Buddhaghosa carrying on through this phenomenological project of examining the states of the monk practitioner, because he's got a particular purpose, the purpose of attaining the wisdom that the Buddha taught about the nature of how things are. In particular, the Buddha said that suffering comes from clinging. Clinging is the general term for wanting things or wanting to avoid things as inevitably happens in life. And the Buddha said that if there was a detachment from that clinging, if there's a way of being in which that clinging doesn't happen, then things simply happen and they do not have the salience by which suffering occurs. Very broad way of putting the point of Buddhist insight. So Buddhaghosa said, okay, in this method of contemplating my subjectivity, the phenomenological states, analyzing them, what I'm going to try and do is to therapeutize away the attachment for these states, because attachment is clinging. Clinging is what makes you susceptible to what life brings you. And that susceptibility is suffering. So if there is a detachment from the dimensions to which we cling to, how we look, how we feel, what's going to happen to us, how others receive us, how we are going to receive others, etc. If we are able to, in that analysis, gain a detachment from who we take ourselves to be, according to Buddhaghosa, we start removing the ties of clinging and therefore the suffering from which the Buddha tries to release us. Now, it's not important here for me to be particularly defending the plausibility of the Buddha's teachings or indeed Buddhaghosa's interpretation. What I'm saying is simply to give that as the background, to say what is the purpose for Buddhaghosa's disciplinary phenomenology? Why is he going through this systematic process? He's doing it because he wants to find this therapy from attachment. That's just what he happens to be doing, thereby demonstrating that when we are looking at an ecological phenomenology, we must be attentive to why that kind of consideration of subjectivity happens. Now, in doing so, he provides a way of looking at the bodily being, which seems to strike me as a phenomenology that is alert to and provides an alternative to the captivation of dualism. Now, why is that so? Because, of course, Buddhaghosa, like all the other Indian philosophers, was functioning from in a paradigm in which philosophy was not about overcoming the mind-body world, the mind-body or the mind-world duality, but occurring from a completely different conceptual space. As Maria Heim puts it in a recent book, Indian philosophy offers an endless array of approaches to our bodily being. In this case, it is Buddhaghosa's use of the categories of Abhidhamma, the corpus and method of developing lists of items encountered in subjective analysis as occurrences in phenomenological exploration. This is just an example. Now, I want to clarify at this point something that people have said about this omission in my book, which is to say, oh, surely you're not saying that there aren't Indian dualisms. Of course there are. Of course there are. There are metaphysical systems in whose ontologies a distinction is made between material objects and immaterial substances like the mind, or between materiality as a whole and consciousness as a whole. So there are those kinds of dualisms, but they do not become the epistemological paradigm to be accepted or challenged in the way in which modern Western philosophy becomes a response or a reaction to Descartes. This is because these ontologies, which use distinctions between the material and the immaterial, or the conscious and the non-conscious, are not using them as this epistemological paradigm to overcome a self-developed skepticism. They're not baffling themselves by saying, if this is the subject, how is their knowledge of the world? So in other words, these dualisms merely offer themselves as an ontological picture, not as an epistemological project of overcoming ignorance, that overcoming, as it were, skeptical ignorance. So while, of course, there are many kinds of dualisms in classical India, they do not have the paradigmatic implication of how to overcome our bafflement over the knowledge of ourselves that Descartes comes to pose to modern philosophy. So I just needed to get that out of the way. So it's not that there aren't all kinds, an array of different metaphysical and ontological positions. It's rather that I'm pursuing this particular phenomenological path in different contexts, and in the case of today's talk, in the context of Buddhaghosa. So I'm now going to very quickly go through a fairly demanding notion of how Buddhaghosa practices different forms of meditation. Amongst them are such things as taking up different dead bodies, corpses, and calmly and unflinchingly looking at bloated bodies and cut up bodies and dissected bodies and shriveled up bodies and burnt bodies as a way of saying, this is what the body becomes. This is what exists of what we take ourselves to be when we are gone. What does it say about the living body if it can be dead in that way? So a practice of detachment. And then a version of that is also focusing on what is called the repulsiveness of the body, to take our own living body and look as its effluence, look at things like phlegm and say, why am I attached to that which I take to be myself, which has got things which repulse me? How is it that at one and the same time, it is minus in my phlegm, and yet the phlegm is entirely other to me? So again, you could see the investigation of what it feels to throw out phlegm is itself a kind of a phenomenological exploration of what is it that I am in this bodiliness. And then the third is perhaps the most philosophically rigorous, which is looking at different aspects or different constituents of the body according to the Abhidhamma traditions. So I'm going to jump through the details of these practices. The end result of these kind of meditative practices is that in each of these cases, as I said, a certain kind of therapeutization is the purpose, the intention in that way, of the phenomenological analysis. So if you take up the corpses as a meditation subject, you start with these objectified entities. You already flinch from seeing a bloated object. You already quiver with disgust at seeing one eaten up by dogs in the cremation ground. So you have particular subjective orientations. And you start then asking, what is it that repulses you about it? You come to the point where you realize, for example, that you are at one and the same time treating it as the object that it has become, and yet also you're flinching because you realize that the body that you take for yourself and that you have a fundamentally different relationship with, it seems, is going to be like them. So you start thinking that if there is, say, a few spatiotemporal distinctions, no difference between the corpse and I who am contemplating the corpse, then what does it say about the nature of my bodily subjectivity? So that would be the kind of analysis that the corpse meditation would bring up. And in a very similar way, mindfulness on the repulsiveness of bits of the body, as I've already indicated, challenges the relationship between the objective and the subjective. Not so much to try and overcome that relationship, but rather to pay attention to the fact that our phenomenological states are constantly alternating between, depending on what we are thinking about, as in the case of the example of the burning, we're alternating between the cough. I mean, I've got a bad cough. I've been coughing up phlegm. On the one hand is the livedness of the phlegm moving through me that is mine to care about. And then it becomes an object which goes into a piece of paper and is thrown away and is as much not me as anything can possibly be. So what you see in this is not the creation of an ontology of subjects and objects, but rather a process in which the same entities shift in the salience they possess in our phenomenological field. I won't go into the third example of the aggregates because it's a technically massively complex process, which we have to spend the whole talk just on that. So why, again, to just clarify, do Maria and I call this an ecological phenomenology? So our point about ecology, therefore, is that we can make the distinctions that we find in any philosophical system, exactly as the biologist and the chef can talk to each other and understand what they are talking about. So it's perfectly possible to make analytic distinctions. It's not that Buddhaghosa cannot talk about the corpse versus the living body, the dead or the alive, the inside or the outside, the phlegm within me, the phlegm outside me, the body and the world, consciousness and object. Any philosophical clarification of the world is possible as analytic distinctions. But what his contemplative practice, this disciplinary phenomenology, shows, perhaps more than most philosophical phenomenologists have talked about, is that these distinctions we make are guided by the purposive orientation, the reason why we want to contemplate something. So as I say, as subjects, there are objects, as person, there is world, as consciousness, there are states, as feelings, there are prompts, as mind, there is body. We can we can trade in these analytic distinctions because they have certain kinds of practical purposes. In the case of Buddhaghosa, of course, the ultimate practical purpose is gaining Buddhist insight. But even in perfectly ordinary life, the disciplining of our phenomenology shows that we are constantly working with these states in dialogue with one another, and we're able to make those distinctions. But to ontologize them seems to deliver nothing in addition. So I sum that up by saying dualities or any kinds of such distinctions, or even, in fact, monolithic metaphysics, are all localized taxonomic systems. That is to say, they are localized to the particular purpose that the philosopher sets out to defend. So there is a radical contingency to our ontologies. They are simply where we stop doing phenomenology. So Buddhaghosa demonstrates a capacity to make those distinctions. The very practices, as I said, are embedded in a world of diversity. But that activity of mapping the phenomenology, which he does to gain, to have a therapy of detachment, those activities are continuous. So if a Buddhist practitioner lived per impossible for 1,000 years, there would be an endless generation of such different phenomenological states. And indeed, for the Buddhists, that's what the Buddha did. Across all his lifetimes and his omniscience, he was continuously dealing with an infinite phenomenal reality, an endless generation of states of analysis, in which an ontology would simply be a moment which will come and go, and at which we should not stop. So that is what I'm trying to say in terms of an intercultural phenomenology here. I'm taking a framing of the phenomenological project as it has come to be possible through 20th century thought, in particular in Merleau-Ponty. The question he asks becomes pressing and relevant globally. It is not something that occurs just in the context of a Western mind or in a particular moment in France or whatever. This, anybody thinking about the ambiguity they face about why they sometimes feel a distance between themselves and their body, and at other times cannot be anything other than their own body, that ambiguity is something that is compelling. How it became compelling and in what methodological fashion is particular to the history of Western thought. So this problem is at one at the same time intercultural and specifically cultural. And therein lies the richness of an intercultural phenomenology. If you looked at Buddhaghosa without thinking about the way phenomenology comes to be framed as a problematization, you will perhaps not be able to see the riches that are available in his practices. But at the same time, if you're aware of how he goes about doing this, or other cases that I've studied in other genres of Indian thought, if you don't know how he constitutes a way of looking phenomenologically at our experience in our states through a different conceptual lens, with different kinds of conceptual and existential challenges, then you will not be allowed to have the opportunity of asking what would happen if we were not caught in the particular historical trajectory that stretches from Descartes to Merleau-Ponty. So intercultural philosophy here becomes a mutual illumination, a way of asking questions about who we are, which is at one and the same time intuitive, accessible, and yet bafflingly difficult to answer in any one singular way. Thank you.